I'm going to be kicking off the first of two pollination talks. So we're going to be focusing primarily on honeybees in this first presentation, and then the next presentation is going to delve more into wild bees. So think about that if you have any interest in either one, and you can kind of adjust your follow-up questions accordingly. Almost there. Nope. There. Oh. Missing a slide there. There we go. Looks like it's an older version, but we will adapt. It's all good. Okay. Okay, great. Well, what I'm going to be talking about is pollination insights, optimizing honeybee-mediated pollination in high-bush blueberry. I'm just one of several individuals that contributed to this project. This is a multi-state project funded through the United States Department of Agriculture. So if you look at that list of names, just recognize that this is an important team effort from all the other institutions that you see on this slide as well. So this is to talk about blueberry pollination. Let's set the stage and talk about blueberry pollination in general. So blueberry is a crop that does require insect-mediated pollination, meaning it requires an insect to move that pollination around to then initiate fertilization and berry development. So if you look at this image on the top left here, you can see what happens. Oh, looks like I don't have a pointer with the PDF version, but if you look at the top left here, you'll see if we exclude pollinators during the bloom period, we see reduced fruit set and reduced berry size. This is in Duke. We see this in other cultivars as well. When we look at who's doing the bulk of pollination services in blueberry, it is the honeybee. And honeybees, they have the benefit of a lot of numbers, a lot of individuals that can provide that pollination service, but they're not necessarily the most effective relative to, say, bumblebees or other wild species. And they also have low attraction between the blueberry flower, and then they have handling behaviors that can lead to some challenges and inefficiencies. But again, they're high in their population densities, and when the weather is good, they can really provide that foraging force that we need. But because of those challenges, pollination is often variable and insufficient. And then we also have been told repeatedly from beekeepers that are providing colonies for blueberry pollination is that the health of those colonies are declining after pollination. And there's a lot of hypotheses why that might be, but that is a challenge, and the increases in expenses that those beekeepers incur leads to higher costs that are passed on to the grower. And I know a lot of growers have seen an increase in their costs for their hives. All in all, what this is pointing to is that growers and beekeepers too need evidence-based strategies to improve blueberry pollination. And so that brings us to the blueberry pollination team. We were feeling really creative, if I might be sarcastic, and we titled ourselves the Blueberry Pollination Project Team. We are members of multiple institutions, as I mentioned previously, lots of technicians, time slip support that are all contributing to addressing some of the questions that I'll go into more depth in a moment. But our overall objective is to investigate the biology and best practices to achieve optimal pollination from honeybees, and then to leverage those results so that we create decision aid tools that growers, beekeepers, and crop consultants can use to inform pollination strategies. So I'm going to cover the 5 objectives and 5 topics for this project. Again, this is 4 years, so this is very surface level, but the key goal here with my presentation is to give you the main takeaways from this large project. So we're going to talk about pollination requirements, what we've learned with regards to hive placement, stocking density, how the environment can affect pollination, and then decision aid tools that we're working on developing. So first, we're going to talk about pollination requirements. This is representing work done by Dr. Stan Schaubert at the University of Florida, and great member of our project team. So a little bit of background, high-bush blueberry like Duke and Draper, they have a high degree of self-compatibility, meaning self-pollen from that same cultivar can germinate on the stigma, pollinate, and fertilize that flower. But there's this other feature called self-sterility and early acting inbreeding depression. What this means is that a lot of those seeds that start to develop from those embryos start to abort. And when we have more abortion and less seed formation, we see a reduction in berry size, maybe even a reduction in fruit set. And so, that self-pollination concern is might be limiting some of our ability to achieve maximum yield. And so Stan did a number of really controlled cross-pollination studies where he looked at, what would happen if I pollinate Duke with Duke or Duke with Draper or Duke with Calypso, and looked at the pollination outcomes. And what he found is that cross-pollination improves pollination outcomes across most blueberry cultivars. Here's a table that summarizes it. We have some printouts of this table as well. It just shows qualitatively if we saw a gain, a decrease, or a decline when we cross-pollinate various cultivars listed in this column with other cultivars of northern highbush blueberry. So you'll see, if you look at the positive green, that for variables like fruit mass, firmness, fruit set, and ripening time, we often saw benefits when we cross-pollinated these northern highbush blueberry cultivars. But a little word of warning, this was done in a greenhouse with young plants. Now, the next question I think we need to ask is, well, does this translate to the field? And what is the magnitude of difference that we see if we start cross-pollinating these cultivars? The next work I'm going to be discussing took place here in Washington as well as other states within the US. This work represents work that was done by Kayla Brower. She's a former graduate student in my program, and Dr. Maxime Erarts. And for this project, we asked the question, what happens and how important is hive placement in the landscape when it comes to blueberry pollination? So what we often see is the hives are dispersed along the perimeter of the field. The thought with this process is honeybee has low attraction when it comes to blueberry flowers. So let's kind of put the honeybees close to the blueberry field and try to improve the chances of pollination. But there's really no data backing up this practice. In addition, we talked earlier about health concerns that we have with honeybee hives. This placement strategy does put them more at risk for drift, particularly for some of the fungicides that we use during the bloom period to protect those flowers. So we asked the question, well, what happens if you aggregate the hives together or clump them and place them away from the edge of the field? So we did this experiment over the course of 2 years, and we did the work in Washington, Oregon, and Michigan. And we had 2 different treatments, essentially clumped and dispersed. On the top is our clump strategy. On the bottom is our dispersed strategy. We had a total of 26 and 28 fields over all these locations in 2021 and 2022 respectively. So massive experiment, a lot of great data. And what we saw is that clumping consistently increased honeybee activity relative to the dispersed treatment. And that was what this figure is trying to show. And this table here, it's maybe a little bit nuance, but what I'm really trying to show here is we looked at all of these different variables. And if you look at this column here, we have a p-value and we have a statistical threshold of significance of p-value 0.05 or less. And so when we looked at characteristics like region or hive density, they weren't significant, but time and time again, placement was statistically significant. And we saw a 2.6 and a 1.3-fold increase in honeybee visitation with the clump strategy in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest, respectively. When we look at things like fruit set, berry size or weight and seed set, though, we didn't see any differences. And my hypothesis for that is that we were using Duke in the Pacific Northwest. It has a relatively low pollen limitation. So regardless of increases in honeybee activity, even the dispersed treatment was having adequate pollination. So we didn't see these gains in some of these other production metrics, but we might in a cultivar like Liberty, which is more pollen limited. Another thing that we did is we looked at pesticide exposure with these different displacement treatments and looked at the role of distance and how that could affect pesticide exposure. We used these silicone bands that passively sample pesticides in the environment during the bloom period. And what we saw was this continual trend of decreasing pesticide exposure with clumping, which you might surmise because the hives are placed further away from the field edge. And we did more in-depth work where we looked at, well, what happens if you place these silicone bands that sample pesticides in the field, right on the edge, which represents this configuration, and then at various distances away from the field edge. I converted these to different numbers, essentially. I used yards, but again, this is an older version from a couple of weeks ago that got up here. But the main takeaway is that the infield silicone bands and the ones right along the edge were statistically the same. So essentially, hives right on the edge of the field are getting the same level of exposure to pesticides as right in the field. But once we got to about 25, 30 yards away from the field edge, then the pesticide levels significantly decline. The other thing that we learned is that beekeeper efficiencies were greatly increased with the clumping strategy when it came to deploying, managing the hives while they were in blueberry, and then removing the hives from blueberry fields. So they were really big proponents because it was very much more cost effective, particularly in areas like Whatcom County and Skagit County, when there's a lot of honeybees that need deployed over a short period of time. That dispersed configuration takes a lot of time to place them relative to clumping. So there were a lot of efficiencies gained from them, from that strategy as well. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about work that was done by Laura Goldstein. She's a master's student at Michigan State University, but she also conducted her work in Washington, Oregon, and Michigan. And for this, we looked at what role stocking density and colony strength have on pollination. So there's a lot of work that's been done just on stocking density, or how many hives are in a field. And there's recommendations for proper stocking densities for blueberry pollination as well. But a lot of those recommendations might be outdated when we think about our modernizing production systems where plants are at closer spacing. We have new cultivars that have higher bloom density, essentially more flowers in a given area that might require pollination and increase stocking densities. When we look at the literature, even literature that my program has contributed, we see a really inconsistent response, though, to changing hive densities and bee activity and pollination outcomes. And what was hypothesized in this work is that that inconsistent response might be due to the fact that we're not taking into account the actual population of those hives, or how many workers are in those hives. And the word for, the number of individuals or the population size in that colony is referred to as colony strength. So we looked at that for this project over the course of 2 years. And just to kind of walk through a scenario, say we stock a field with, this says 10 hives to the acre, but say it's 6 hives to the acre. That's more realistic for our area. That doesn't really take into consideration, are those hives, 15,000 workers? Are there 30,000 workers? Or are there 60,000 workers? And with honeybees, then the greater the number of workers, or the greater the strength, the greater proportion of workers that they can dedicate to foraging and pollinating activity. So in essence, strength and population size really matters when we think about placement of hives in our landscape and the ultimate number. So this is a little bit of a tricky figure to kind of distill the work results that Lauren found through this research. But essentially what I want you to look at this figure is that if we see a dark line, that means it's a statistically significant relationship. If it's a dashed line with an X through it, that means there's no statistically significant relationship. And then if it's blue, it means that they're interdependent. So here what we're looking at is stocking density, or hives per acre, colony strength, which is again the number of individuals, which was indirectly assessed with a metric called returned foragers. And this is a really simple method, and there's some cards on how you can do this from your truck, just to kind of qualitatively assess the strength of your hives. And then if you multiply returning forager count and stocking density, you get this variable called stocking strength. So stocking density and the strength included together. And then we have bee visitation and pollination and yield. So what we observed is that increasing honey visitation improves pollination and yield to a point. It kind of plateaus to a certain extent. So it's not a linear relationship. The more bees per flower doesn't always mean, higher berry size and higher fruit set. It plateaus. But the key takeaway from this was that the honeybee visitation was best predicted, and the most significant relationship was when we factored in the colony strength. So the stocking strength was really important to kind of predict and show the relationship of bee visitation and pollination and yield. So it really underscores that when we come up with these recommendations for stocking bees in field, colony strength really matters. And we're working on trying to distill that into user-friendly recommendations. Now I want to talk about heat effects on pollination. This is work done by Dr. Jenna Walters at Michigan State University. She did these studies with Petri dishes where she exposed blueberry pollen to various temperatures and observed what happened. Did the pollen germinate? Did it grow? And what she found out is once we got above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the pollen stops growing and it's non-recoverable. So this major takeaway was that extreme heat events does reduce pollen viability and functioning, risking pollination success. And we identified a threshold that's been really important in terms of understanding what heat events mean here during our bloom period and defining, how we might try to manage that in the future. And that threshold is, 86 and above essentially. Lastly, I want to talk about the decision aid tools. So how we're trying to take these findings and get it into your hands. These decision aid tools are going to be available through our website. There's going to be a QR code on the subsequent slide. And we have two tools. One is the bloom predictor, and you're going to be able to indirectly access that through the decision aid system through Washington State University for free. What this bloom predictor does is it predicts based on the environment, when does bloom start in your blueberry field and when does it end? So you can work more closely with your beekeeper in terms of aligning arrival of those bees as well as removal of those bees so that you can start to implement practices like aphid management when those bees are gone. So here's just a screenshot of what that looked like. That should be rolling out in a couple of months for you to use. And then we're also working on a stocking density tool to leverage our findings and come up with recommendations on, well, how many bees you should stock for a given field and what might that mean economically based on various yield scenarios. There's lots of resources that this team has developed and is continuing to develop in the final few months of the project. So again, we have our website that you can scan the QR code there. A lot of cards that hopefully you can grab. They're on the back table. This one in the center is, how you can just qualitatively grade colonies from your truck and see if it's like a high, strong colony or if it's a weak colony. So you can start to initiate that conversation with your beekeeper of, hey, this colony looks like it's weak or dead. Maybe we should replace it or add more hives. And then one I'm really proud of is Lena Helmrich. She's developed this guide of best management practices for pollination and blueberry. So synthesizing the literature and the project findings. And that's, we're working on just getting it online. It's done essentially. So it's a great product. So some conclusions is just general takeaways to summarize all this information. So honeybees are globally important pollinators. What we're seeing is cross-pollination is beneficial for most of our northern highbush blueberry cultivars. How that translates to the field and the magnitude of those effects, I think is something that would be really interesting to look at from a research perspective. Clumping hives promotes beekeeper efficiencies, it increases bee activity, and it may reduce pesticide exposure without compromising crop pollination. And then when it comes to stocking densities, our traditional stocking density recommendations of hives per acre really are missing the important contribution of the strength. And growers should really work with their beekeepers to talk about how to factor in and get high quality or strong hives for pollination. Then we also have learned extreme heat events threaten pollination, and there's follow-up work in my program looking at how we can mitigate that with various practices. And then last but not least, and this paves the way for the next presentation, wild bees are still important for pollination. I think they're part of just building a resilient pollination portfolio, and they should be conserved through good stewardship. But there's a lot more research that we need on wild bees to kind of effectively try to incorporate them in our production systems. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. And if I have time, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
The clumping, how far away from the field do you think you could be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how far away from the field you can be? So ours were a minimum of like, I'd say 12 feet away. So it really varied based on the field and the configuration of the field. We're still doing and analyzing some follow-up data though too to kind of see when it comes to the pesticide exposure, what does that decay curve look like? Because I think the ideal placement would be, far enough away from the field that you're really minimizing on drift risk. And then, aggregating those hives together like when you're clumping them. But hopefully that answered your question. Great.
I guess we'll let Tom ask a question.
On the fungicide exposure, do you think that bees get most of their exposure, from the surface of the hive, or are they also getting a lot of exposure from contact with the flowers or through the nectar or through the pollen?
Yep. That's a great question, Tom, and a great comment. So, for us, all we looked at was what was on the exterior of those hives. So we know based on these configurations and locations, the hive is getting more or less exposure. We don't know what it means from like the exposure of the bees. And there's certainly other avenues such as floral transmission, just by visiting the flowers, they could be exposed to that pollen or exposed to the pesticide. We're also trying to do some follow-up work where, and we've This is actually maybe a funny story. So we try to take those silicone bands and put them on the bottom board and in the hive to see, well, is there any relationship on the exterior and the interior when it comes to these pesticides? But the bees were persistent in pushing those out, and we really couldn't get a lot of data. So we're trying some other approaches, hopefully with continued funding.
Great, thank you, Lisa. With that, we're going to move on.